there comes a moment that's hard to explain and even harder to share with anyone else. You start to notice that you're no longer truly seen or understood the way you once were. Conversations that used to feel natural now feel thin, repetitive, almost scripted. You listen, you respond, but something inside you stays quiet, untouched. The words are there, but the depth is gone. It's not that people suddenly changed overnight. It's that something in you shifted first. Those close to you begin to notice it before you can name it. They say things like, "You've changed," or "You're more distant lately." Some call you cold. Others say you're strange, withdrawn, not as emotionally available as before. And what makes this so unsettling is that you don't have a clear answer for them. You're not angry. You're not depressed. You're not trying to push anyone away. You simply feel different. Calmer, perhaps. Less reactive. Less hungry for connection that feels forced or inside. There's a quiet recognition that the old ways of relating no longer fit. Small talk feels exhausting. Explaining yourself feels unnecessary. You're no longer trying to be mirrored, validated, or emotionally met in the ways you once needed. But you can't yet explain what replaced that need. All you know is that pretending feels heavier than silence, and adjusting yourself to be understood feels more painful than being misunderstood. This is where the confusion sets in. You start to wonder if something is wrong with you, if you're becoming disconnected, if you're losing empathy. But the truth is more subtle. Something silent has happened beneath the surface. Something internal and irreversible. Your inner world has shifted, but the people around you are still relating to the version of you that no longer exists. And so a gap appears, not because you're superior or detached, but because you're no longer operating from the same emotional frequency. This moment can feel lonely, even alienating, because no one around you seems to notice what you're noticing. You're standing still internally while the world keeps speaking a language that suddenly feels unfamiliar. And yet, this quiet dissonance is often the first sign of awakening. Not loud, not dramatic, just a subtle sense that you've stepped out of an old pattern while everyone else is still inside it. If this resonates with you, you're not alone, and there's much more beneath this surface shift. If you want to explore this process more deeply, subscribe to the channel, like this video if it put words to something you've been feeling, and leave a comment sharing whether you've noticed this quiet distance growing in your own life. As this inner shift deepens, fear often becomes the constant background noise. Not a sharp fear, but a quiet unease that follows you through ordinary moments. You begin to wonder if you are slowly becoming someone difficult to be around, someone heavier, less accessible, less pleasant. You notice yourself speaking less, choosing words more carefully, withdrawing not out of anger but out of fatigue, and that silence makes you question yourself. You ask whether something in you is closing, hardening, or breaking. The mind looks for explanations it already knows. Maybe you're traumatized. You tell yourself. Maybe this is emotional damage surfacing late. Maybe you're turning antisocial, losing empathy, becoming disconnected in a way that isn't healthy. These thoughts don't come from self-hatred, but from the need to make sense of what no longer fits into familiar emotional categories. You want a name for this state? Something you can point to and say, "This is why I feel this way." Without that name, uncertainty grows. What hurts most is not being alone, but being misunderstood while still caring deeply. You feel things, often more clearly than before, yet your inner experience refuses to translate into simple language. When you try to explain, your words sound wrong, even to your own ears. They feel incomplete, inadequate, or misleading. So you stop trying, and when you stop trying to explain, the distance others feel begins to widen. They interpret your quiet as rejection, your restraint as coldness, your boundaries as emotional withdrawal. But this suffering is not the pain of being rejected. It is the pain of moving through a transformation that does not yet have a vocabulary. You are changing faster internally than your ability to describe that change. Your nervous system, your sense of self, your way of relating, are reorganizing beneath the surface. While the world around you still expects the old version of you to respond on cue, the gap between inner reality and outer expectation creates confusion, not failure. In T-space, you may feel suspended between who you were and who you are becoming, unable to fully inhabit either, and that limbo can feel deeply uncomfortable, even frightening. But it does not mean you are broken. It means you are in a phase where clarity has not yet caught up with experience. The silence, the hesitation, the sense of being difficult or different are not signs of emotional loss. They are signs that something new is forming, still without words, still without shape, but undeniably alive within you. What if this growing sense of being misunderstood is not a social failure at all, but a psychological signal? What if the distance you feel in conversations, in relationships, in familiar environments did not begin outside of you, but quietly within? This is the moment where the story begins to turn, because it invites a different interpretation of what's happening. Instead of asking why others no longer understand you, the question becomes what has changed in the way you are relating, sensing, and attaching. When awakening begins, it doesn't announce itself loudly. It starts as an internal shift, a subtle reorganization of priorities, needs, and emotional reflexes. You stop reaching automatically. You pause before reacting. You no longer seek reassurance in the same ways, or from the same sources. And because most human connection is built on shared emotional patterns and predictable responses, this internal change disrupts the unspoken agreements that once held relationships together. From the outside, this looks like withdrawal. From the inside, it feels like clarity. The system that once pulled you toward approval, validation, or emotional mirroring begins to loosen its grip. Your attachment patterns start to change, not because you no longer care, but because you no longer need to regulate your sense of safety through others in the same way. And when that happens, incomprehension appears. This is the first real turning point. The problem is no longer that people don't understand you. The problem is that they are still responding to a version of you that your inner world has already outgrown. The awakening does not separate you from others by force. It creates distance by changing the emotional language you speak, long before anyone else realizes the conversation has shifted. Most relationships are not held together only by affection or shared history, but by quiet, unspoken agreements. These agreements are rarely discussed, yet they shape how people connect every day. There is an expectation of emotional predictability. You react in familiar ways, you offer the same reassurance, you play the role others have learned to rely on. There is mutual validation, where each person helps stabilize the other's emotional state. And there are fixed roles, often formed early, that define who listens, who comforts, who adapts, and who leads. These implicit contracts create a sense of safety. They allow relationships to function smoothly, because everyone knows what to expect. But they also limit growth. When awakening begins, something subtle changes. You stop automatically managing the emotional atmosphere. You're no longer rushed to soothe discomfort, fill silence, or mirror feelings just to maintain harmony. Not out of indifference, but because you're no longer driven by the same attachment drift. This is where the invisible agreement breaks. Others may feel unsettled, even threatened, without understanding why. The emotional regulation they unconsciously depended on is no longer being provided. The familiar roles no longer activate. From their perspective, you've changed the rules without warning. From your perspective, you've simply stopped performing. The resulting tension is not a failure of connection, but a sign that the relationship was partly sustained by unconscious regulation rather than conscious presence. When that regulation ends, what remains is exposed. Some connections deepen, others dissolve. The incomprehension that follows is the echo of a contract ending. Not because you rejected anyone, but because you finally stepped out of a role you were never meant to play forever. Long before this experience was described in spiritual or existential terms, it was already being observed in psychology. Mary Ainsworth was one of the first to reveal how deeply attachment shapes the way we perceive safety, connection, and even ourselves. Her work showed that human bonds are not formed only through affection or love, but through emotional regulation. From early on, we learned how closeness feels, how security is maintained, and how much of ourselves we must adjust to remain connected. According to Ainsworth, attachment patterns become internal maps. They guide how we seek reassurance, how we respond to distance, and how we stabilize our emotions through others. Most adult relationships quietly follow these learned patterns. But when awakening begins, those internal maps start to dissolve. The nervous system no longer reacts automatically. Old attachment strategies lose their urgency. This is why the shift feels so confusing. It's not just spiritual insight or emotional maturity. It's a neuropsychological reorganization. The brain and nervous system are no longer operating from the same attachment scripts learned in the past. When those scripts fade, relationships feel different, communication shifts, and misunderstanding arises. What looks like withdrawal is often the nervous system no longer clinging to familiar patterns of safety. Imagine two people standing in the same room, looking at the same scene, yet seeing entirely different worlds. Nothing in the environment has changed, but the lenses through which they perceive it are no longer aligned. One lens is shaped by fear of distance, by the need for reassurance, by the quiet urgency to stay close at all costs. Through this lens, connection feels like survival, and proximity becomes proof of safety. The other lens has shifted. It no longer scans for signs of abandonment or approval. Presence is no longer negotiated through emotional effort or constant responsiveness. Silence does not space is not interpreted as rejection. This person remains present, but no longer bends themselves to be accepted or understood. When these two lenses meet, communication begins to fail. Words pass between them, but meanings do not. What one experiences as calm, the other feels as cold. What one experiences as autonomy, the other interprets as distance. The issue is not intention or care, but perception. They are no longer operating within the same emotional system. This is why misunderstanding arises so easily. At this stage, it is not that one person is right and the other is wrong. They are simply relating from different internal worlds, and until those worlds align again or separate completely, the gap between them will continue to be felt, even in the most familiar spaces. What you are experiencing needs to be named correctly, because without a name, it easily turns into self-blame. You are not isolated in the way isolation is usually understood. You are not being abandoned, and you are not failing at connection. You are moving through a transition of attachment. An old, reactive pattern that once shaped how you bonded with others is loosening its hold, and that shift naturally creates space. In reactive attachment, connection is driven by urgency. There is a constant monitoring of emotional signals, a need to respond, to adjust, to stay aligned so closeness is not threatened. As this pattern fades, the impulse to reach out automatically disappears. You are no longer pulled to fill silence, explain yourself, or maintain emotional continuity at all costs. What replaces it, however, is not yet fully formed. This is where the sense of social emptiness arises. The old way of relating has collapsed, but the new way has not stabilized. You are standing between systems. The familiar bonds no longer activate, yet deeper, more conscious forms of connection have not had time to emerge. This gap can feel unsettling, even lonely, but it is not a regression. It is the necessary pause between attachment driven by fear and connection grounded in presence. In this passé, the most common mistake is trying to repair the discomfort by over-explaining yourself. You feel the tension in relationships and instinctively try to resolve it with words, clarifications, and emotional justifications. You explain your silence, your boundaries, your inner changes, hoping that if others understand, the distance will disappear. But this usually has the opposite effect. The more you explain, the more misunderstood you feel, because you are trying to translate an internal shift that has not yet settled into clear language. Another trap is forcing connection, reaching out when there is no genuine impulse, maintaining closeness out of obligation, or staying emotionally available just to avoid being seen as distant. This often leads to subtle self-betrayal. You sense yourself shrinking, softening your edges, or returning to old roles simply to preserve proximity. In doing so, you begin to invalidate your own experience. You adapt your awareness to fit the comfort of others, even when it no longer feels true. This doesn't restore connection. It erodes trust in yourself, and paradoxically, it increases confusion. Others feel when you adjust your consciousness to be understood, you lose clarity. When you stop doing that, incomprehension may remain for a while, but integrity returns. And integrity is the only ground from which real connection can grow. As this transition continues, a new quality of presence begins to emerge. It is not dramatic or expressive, and it does not announce itself. It is felt more than seen. You respond less automatically, not because you care less, but because you are no longer driven by reflex. There is more observation, more space between stimulus and response. You notice what is happening without immediately stepping in to manage it. Silence becomes natural, rather than uncomfortable. This shift is subtle, yet deeply noticeable to others. People sense that something has changed, even if they cannot explain what it is. Your energy feels calmer, less available for emotional urgency. The familiar cues they once relied on, quick reassurance, predictable reactions, constant engagement, are no longer present. And without those cues, uncertainty arises. For those who depended on your emotional predictability, your silence can feel unsettling. What once felt like safety now feels like distance. They may interpret your stillness as withdrawal or indifference, when in truth, it is presence without performance. You are no longer filling space to soothe tension or maintain connection. You are simply there. This new presence does not seek to control how it is perceived. It allows misunderstanding to exist without rushing to correct it. And while this can create discomfort in relationships built on emotional dependency, it also opens the door to something more honest. A form of connection that does not rely on constant regulation, but on mutual awareness and choice. It's important to clear away the illusions that often surround the idea of awakening. This process is not enlightenment, and it does not place you above anyone else. It is not a badge of wisdom or a sign of moral superiority. There is nothing glamorous about it. In fact, much of the time it feels disorienting, awkward, and deeply uncomfortable. The confusion you experience is not a failure of growth, but a consequence of internal reorganization. What is actually happening is far more grounded. Your attachment system is being recalibrated. The ways you once sought safety, closeness, and reassurance are losing their automatic force. Old emotional reflexes weaken before new ones are fully formed. This creates instability, not clarity. You may feel less certain, less expressive, less emotionally synchronized with others, even as your awareness deepens. Because attachment patterns are relational. This discomfort doesn't stay contained within you. Others feel it too. They sense the shift but don't understand it, and that uncertainty can trigger their own defenses. This is why awakening often disrupts relationships rather than elevating them. It removes familiar emotional signals without immediately replacing them. Understanding this helps remove unnecessary guilt. You are not becoming detached or superior. You are moving through a necessary internal adjustment. Discomfort is not a sign that something is wrong. It is a sign that the old structure can no longer support who you are becoming, for you or for the people around you. There is a familiar story that unfolds quietly in many lives. It's the story of someone who was always the safe place for others. The one who listened without judgment, absorbed tension, smoothed conflicts, and made people feel emotionally held. Being needed became second nature. Their presence was associated with comfort, stability, and relief. And over time, this role felt like love. Then something changed. Not suddenly, and not out of resentment. They stopped carrying what wasn't theirs. They listened without rescuing. They stayed present without absorbing emotional weight, and almost immediately, the reactions around them shifted. People began to say they felt different, more distant, less warm. The same person, in the same body, now perceived as unfamiliar. At first, this was deeply confusing. How could offering less emotional labor feel like withdrawal? But slowly, a painful clarity emerged. Much of the affection they received had been tied to a function, not a presence. They were valued for what they regulated, not for who they were when they simply existed. This realization hurt, but it also freed them. They understood that being loved for a role requires constant performance. Being met for presence requires nothing but truth. And while fewer people remained close, differently, without dependency, without expectation, for the first time, connection was not sustained by emotional service, but by mutual awareness. At these days, the most important invitation is to stop reacting, not in the sense of becoming passive or indifferent, but in the sense of releasing the impulse to defend, explain, or correct how you are perceived. There is a deep habit of justifying yourself when misunderstanding appears, of trying to convince others that you are still good, caring, still the same at your core. But this habit belongs to an older pattern, one rooted in the need to be emotionally recognized in order to feel safe. You are not required to translate your inner state into language that makes others comfortable. Consciousness does not need a spokesperson. The more you try to explain what is happening inside you, the more distorted it becomes. Because this shift is not conceptual. It is lived. It is felt. And anything you try to package into words too early will sound incomplete or false, even to you. Let misunderstanding exist without resistance. Let people form their interpretations without rushing to correct them. This is not abandonment of connection. It is respect for your own timing. Awakening does not need permission, agreement, or comprehension from the outside to be real. It is legitimate simply because it is happening. When you stop reacting, something settles. Not clarity, but alignment. You remain where you are without shrinking or performing. And in that stillness, what is meant to leave will leave, and what is capable of meeting you without explanation will stay. This phase can be understood through the image of internal growth, where the old skin no longer fits what is forming underneath. Just as a body cannot remain in a shell that has become too small, you cannot continue to inhabit patterns of connection that once worked but now feel restrictive. The discomfort you feel is not a flaw. It is the pressure of expansion. Something in you has outgrown the structure that once held it. Old bonds begin to feel tight, awkward, misaligned, not because they were false, but because they were shaped for a version of you that no longer exists. You may try, for a moment, to return to that earlier state, to respond the way you used to soften yourself back into familiar roles, but doing so now requires self-abandonment. It demands that you compress your awareness to fit into a form you have already shed. Tere is no clean return from this point. Once growth has occurred, regression is not healing, it is hiding. The old skin cannot be worn again without damage. What remains is the courage to stay present in the unfamiliar shape of yourself, even while new forms of connection have not yet fully emerged. This in-between space is not a mistake. It is the natural tension between what you were and what you are becoming. In the middle of this transition, there is no need for drastic action or dramatic change. The guidance is surprisingly simple. Continue with your routine. Do what needs to be done each day without expecting it to resolve the deeper shift taking place inside you. Stability in the ordinary helps the nervous system settle while everything else as you move through your days, pay attention to your interactions, but resist the urge to manage them. Do not rush to correct misunderstandings or smooth emotional tension. Let conversations unfold as they are. Notice what happens when you stop explaining yourself, when you no longer fill pauses or justify your boundaries. The responses you receive in these moments are revealing. Some people will quietly step back, not out of cruelty, but because the connection depended on your emotional availability and clarity. Without your explanations, they feel unmoored. Others, however, may draw closer. They are not disturbed by your silence. They are curious, grounded, able to meet you without needing constant reassurance or definition. This observation is not about judgment. It is about awareness. You are learning, in real time, which connections were built on regulation and which can survive presence. By doing nothing extraordinary, by simply remaining as you are, the relational landscape begins to reorganize itself naturally. One of the quiet dangers during this phase is comparison. You may look at others who seem more connected, more expressive, more socially engaged, and wonder if you've taken a wrong turn. People who still live from anxious attachment often appear warmer, more emboldened, more emotionally available. They seek reassurance, validation, and closeness in ways that are familiar and socially rewarded. From the outside, it can look like health or happiness, but comparison here is misleading. Each emotional system awakens in its own rhythm. What feels natural and necessary for one person may feel exhausting or constricting for another. Those who still require constant validation are not behind, and you are not ahead. You are simply in different phases of emotional organization. When you compare your internal state to someone else's external behavior, you lose contact with your own process. You begin to measure your growth by standards that no longer apply. This creates unnecessary doubt and pressure to return to patterns you have already outgrown. Allow others to be where they are without using them as a mirror for yourself. Awakening is not a race, and it is not a hierarchy. It unfolds according to the readiness of the nervous system, not social expectations. Trust the pace of your own unfolding, even when it doesn't resemble anyone else's. At the heart of this experience lies a crucial reframe. You did not become incomprehensible. You stepped out of a role that once made others feel emotionally secure. For a long time, your presence may have been familiar, soothing, predictable. You knew how to respond, how to adapt, how to create a sense of stability for those around you. And without realizing it, that role became part of how others understood you. When you no longer perform that function, confusion naturally follows. People are not reacting to who you are now, but to the absence of what you used to provide. The safety they once felt was tied to your emotional availability, your willingness to regulate, to reassure, to adjust. When that stopped, the structure they relied on collapsed. Incomprehension, then, is not a failure of communication. It is the edge of autonomy. It arises when emotional dependence loses its anchor. What feels like distance is actually differentiation. You are still present, still capable of connection, but no longer organized around the need to stabilize others. This shift can feel isolating, but it marks a profound psychological elevation. You are no longer defined by how well you maintain emotional comfort in your relationships. You are defined by alignment with yourself. And while not everyone will understand this change, Those who can meet you without needing you to be their anchor will recognize it not as loss, but as depth. As this process settles, a quiet truth begins to emerge. Not everyone was meant to follow you into this phase of awareness. Some people were connected to a version of you that no longer exists, and their inability to meet you now is not a judgment of your worth or theirs. It is simply a natural point of differentiation. Paths that once ran together slowly diverge when the inner direction changes. This separation is often mistaken for rejection, but it carries a different meaning. Rejection implies exclusion or abandonment. Differentiation is neither. It is the recognition that shared presence does not always require shared depth. Some relationships end not because of conflict, but because the internal language has changed. What once held connection together no longer speaks in the same way. In this space, silence becomes meaningful. It is no longer an absence, but a form of communication. It signals boundaries without hostility, presence without performance, awareness without explanation. Through silence, you allow relationships to reorganize themselves honestly. What remains is not loss, but clarity. The connections that continue do so without effort or translation, and those that fade leave room for a different quality of meeting, one rooted not in roles or expectations, but in the simple capacity to be with what is. As it is, there is a quiet strength that emerges when you stop shaping yourself to be understood, not because you no longer care, but because you no longer abandon yourself for clarity or approval. When you release the need to be fully interpreted by others, something settles inside you, the tension fades, the inner fragmentation ends, and what remains is a sense of wholeness that does not depend on agreement, recognition, or emotional response from the outside. This is the nature of silent power. It does not argue, it does not persuade. It does not rush to explain itself. It stands grounded, complete, and present. When you stop negotiating your inner truth to fit the emotional comfort of others, you are no longer divided between who you are and who you perform. You become whole, not because everyone understands you, but because you finally understand yourself. This ending does not demand action. There is nothing to fix, nothing to prove, nothing to chase. Just a return to alignment. Let this awareness settle at its own pace. Let it reshape your relationships without force. If this message resonated with you, take a moment to like this video so it can reach others walking through the same silent transition. Subscribe to the channel for deeper reflections on awakening, attachment, and emotional autonomy. And leave a comment if this idea of becoming whole by no longer molding yourself spoke to something in your own life.